On a cold 2018 winter evening in Boston, Massachusetts, Stipe Miocic became the greatest UFC heavyweight of all time by conquering a surging juggernaut that had captured the attention and the imagination of the MMA community, Francis the Predator Ngannou. In this video, I'll explain how the pride of Cleveland and of Croatia, Stipe Miocic, broke the heavyweight title defense record by turning away the most intimidating physical force that heavyweight MMA has ever seen. In the course of doing so, I'll also explain the basic but intelligently applied methods that Stipe used to defeat Ngannou and how these techniques can be applied by ordinary people when confronted by a more physically opposing assailant. I'm Josh, and welcome to this episode of Dialectic of Violence to Catch the Predator. The 1987 film Predator tells the story of an otherworldly extraterrestrial entity that occupies its free time hunting the most dangerous humans on the planet for sport. Cutting its way through a hardened squad of commandos, themselves armed with more guns and steroids than a Jones family barbecue, it appears simply unstoppable. Just communicate that no man is any match for it, the alien creature pimp slaps prime Arnold Schwarzenegger about 30 feet, establishing itself as the inaugural intergalactic power slap champion. But in the end, arrogant and dismissive of its inferiors, the Predator is eventually lured into a trap and defeated not by Schwarzenegger's character's brawn, but by his ingenuity, cunning, and refusal to die. When picking the nickname, I'm sure Francis Ngannou's team simply thought that the monster's cool and that Ngannou was big and strong, and at the time he had dreadlocks. But as it turned out, the MMA gods decided to turn him into a case of nominative determinism, and he would be outsmarted and soundly defeated by the reigning champion, Stipe Miocic. Francis Ngannou had become somewhat of a viral sensation after UFC 218, when he knocked out Alistair Overeem in the first round with a brutal uppercut that saw Overeem's neck snap back so fast that I remember watching it live. I actually thought that he'd broken his neck in real time. After this, the UFC went into promotional overdrive, claiming that they had the next Mike Tyson of MMA and throwing him into a title shot merely 2 months later against Stipe Miocic. At the same time as Francis Ngannou's hype was at an all-time high, Stipe Miocic was butting heads with the UFC and its president Dana White. As a heavyweight champion, he obviously expected to be well paid, but the UFC resented the fact that he didn't really promote himself. He was a soft-spoken guy, didn't like to talk much, actually mumbles when he talks quite a bit, and wasn't interested in doing a lot of travel or marketing. That being said, he is a firefighter, he's a blue-collar guy, he's an EMT, he's someone that really should have been very easily promotable by the company, but due to the fact that the UFC basically maintains a monopoly over the majority of high-level MMA, they basically expect people to promote themselves, given that even though Dana White is supposed to be the promoter, the fact that they own the platform kind of means that the individual fighters have to make themselves stand out. Having a heavyweight champion that didn't really do a lot to stand out, and one which, whilst very, very effective in the cage, didn't really utilize a lot of flashy techniques that really lent themselves towards crazy highlight reel finishes, even though he did have a very good finishing rate, meant that the UFC was pretty much sick of him and wanted to get their new toy, Francis Ngannou, into that seat. It's kind of ironic, how things change, given that Francis famously left the UFC after the negotiations with Dana White broke down. Turns out that heavyweight champions have a lot of prestige and leverage, and that the UFC doesn't like that leverage to be used against them. But anyway, we should probably get back to starting to analyze the fight. Not only had Miocic run afoul of the promotion, but he was also quite consistently dismissed both by MMA fans and by a lot of the pundits out there. While there were some people waving the flag for Stipe Miocic's skill and saying that he had a good chance prior to his fight against Francis Ngannou at UFC 220, the vast majority of fans, fighters, and the pundits believed that Ngannou would knock him out, and that they looked at Stipe Miocic when he's simply not that great because of not recognizing the subtleties in his game. This lack of faith was also shared by the bookmakers, who had Stipe a plus 165 underdog, despite the fact that he was coming off of first-round finishes of Alistair Overeem, Junior Dos Santos, Fabricio Verdum, and Andrei Arlovski. The reason that I picked this fight in particular to do this channel's first specific fight study was that not only do I really love this fight and really enjoy this performance by Stipe, as well as it being interesting to see a more embryonic version of Francis Ngannou, who later massively improved, but also because it is one of those fights where the underlying principles that cause the victory are very, very clear. Sometimes in fights, particularly some of the lower weight classes where the skill level is really, really high, what's actually going on is so obfuscated by all the different techniques and all the complexity of things going through the fight that it's really hard for people actually to sit down and notice what the differences are, and to learn from it. I feel like this particular fight, not only did it show some strategic principles that can be utilized against fighting larger opponents, and I actually think it should be studied by everyone that's interested in martial arts for that reason, but also they are principles that are really well applied to fighting in a real life scenario. If you're attacked by someone and you're able to fight them one-on-one, obviously it's not a cage, it's not a consistent playing field and everything like that, but given that this version of Ngannou's approach was really dominant physicality, bullying his opponents around, there was a lack of complexity to his game, despite him being incredibly dangerous. And that actually allows us to really clearly see the specific techniques that Stipe Miocic used to nullify him, and how they can be utilized against any larger, powerful opponent. If it worked on Ngannou, it's going to work against the drunk, angry guy that tries to pick a fight with you because you sneezed and he thinks you hit on his girlfriend, So because I want to focus on these principles and about their applications in other contexts, rather than going through this fight round by round or by explaining every single exchange, which also is pretty boring for you guys to hear, if you've got UFC Fight Pass or something like that, you can go watch it yourself. You don't need me to do a play-by-play explanation of it. But in doing so, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of the techniques. I'm going to go through some of the principles that underline why these techniques work. And then on screen, you'll see a number of slides that show the specific moments in which they are used and try to sort of illuminate exactly what's going on during the fight. So Stipe Miocic's approach in this fight was to actually attack the body of Francis Ngannou, not in the sense of hitting his ribs, but in the sense of actually degrading his ability to be a physical force, because he was so reliant on his immense power that in order to take away that power, he had to undermine the systems which actually generate it. So when you've got a big, powerful guy like Francis Ngannou, he is going to be able to hit hard anyway, even when exhausted, simply because of his sheer weight. But he is most dangerous when he's able to explode. A lot of guys that are built like him, they are very, very big and bulky, but they are also capable of shocking bursts of speed. But that can only be maintained for a short time because the fast twitch muscle fiber that actually allows them to generate these movements and this power require massive amounts of oxygen that simply cannot be replenished at the same rate that they can be expended. So when looking at Stipe's techniques and how he dominated Ngannou, almost everything that he did was designed in one way or another to tire and exhaust Ngannou. And that is why after a very, very scary sort of first half of round one, Ngannou quickly gassed and was practically demolished the rest of the fight. It was one of the most lopsided decisions I've ever seen, probably the most lopsided decision I've ever seen in heavyweight. And frankly, I think that Ngannou was very lucky that Herb Dean didn't stop this fight at multiple points, which, if I'm being honest, I'm a little suspicious of Herb Dean. I think was because of the promotional weight behind Ngannou. I know that's a serious accusation, but hey, I'm just a guy making a podcast on YouTube. I'm not, someone in any official capacity, and I don't have any evidence for that. It's just my suspicion. So take that with a little bit of a grain of salt. But I do think that under most other circumstances, this was a fight that would probably have been stopped. Maybe this is putting it a little bit too abstract away or a little bit too pretentious away, but to me, thinking about fighting a bigger attacker, it isn't about out-damaging them in individual exchanges or winning every little tactical exchange. It is about guerrilla warfare, breaking down an enemy gradually, preventing them from landing a kill shot, preventing them from landing a big blow that's going to knock you out or disable you, but being able to move around, break them down gradually, and whittle them down to a point where you can actually decisively defeat them. That means that any exchange where the attacker is using more energy than you is a victory. Take those small victories. It's not about KOing the guy in the first exchange. Most fights with a bigger guy, maybe you can get lucky. Maybe you just step in there and you crack them and they happen to have a glass jaw. But realistically, using these harrying tactics, slowing them down, making them a lot less dangerous, and then taking them out when you get a chance to do so is the approach. And that was also the approach that Stipe Miocic took in this fight. He didn't stand and bang in the pocket with him early. He made him expend energy. He made him exhaust himself, both in terms of cardio, but also neurologically, which we'll get to in a bit, and took over and crushed his spirit, crushed his body's capacity to fight properly, and basically turned the most dangerous physical force that we'd seen in the heavyweight division into someone that spent half the fight or more in the fetal position practically. So that's all easy said and done, right? But how do you actually prevent someone that's larger and more powerful and more explosive from KOing you? Well, the first thing is that the initial onslaught, the very beginning of the fight, is the most dangerous part because you haven't got their timing down. You're not really fully familiar with their exact speed, with their exact power, with their range of techniques and what they actually can pull off. So that's always very dangerous. That's why it's very important at the beginning of such a match, and Stipe Miocic showed this against Francis Ngannou, of being conservative defensively. And what I mean by that is I should say conservative offensively. So focusing on defense, focusing on movement and striking defense to survive the initial onslaught. Now, does that mean blocking? Does that mean dodging out of the way? It really depends on the exact exchanges. I would generally say that making someone miss entirely rather than taking shots on the guard is preferable. And the reason being is that whilst if you are completely cornered, take it on the guard, absolutely. If you're backed up against the wall, take it on the guard, sure. That if your intention is to exhaust them, it is better that they miss. So a big person got heavy, big arms. They're usually throwing them in big hooking punches that throw the weight away from their center line. Because your fists are tethered to your arm, obviously, and your shoulders and your back, those have to be pulled in. So even though it seems like a really small thing, those little muscles, that all counts in a high adrenaline point of the fight very early on. So by forcing them to retract their limbs, by missing, it exhausts them faster than it would be to block, because when they hit the guard, any force has a reaction, right? So if you bounce a ball on the ground, it bounces back up. It loses a little bit of power, but it does come back up. So if someone punches you on the guard, that force is going to bounce off of the guard, and that's going to retract. So they still can break their hands and things like this, so it can be, in certain positions good to take it on the arm. But generally speaking, it is preferable to avoid the shots altogether. Also, when they've overswung, they tend to be open to counterattacks. So if someone throws a big right hook at you, you step back out of the way, that right hand is going to fly across their center line, and they're going to have nothing blocking the sort of top right part, or, to you, your left, if you're looking straight forward at them. A key competency that Stipe Miocic used in the defense against Ngannou's first round onslaught was awareness of head position and of his body's position within the context of the cage. So the worst thing you can do when faced with a single opponent that is overwhelmingly more powerful than you is to be cornered, because if you're unable to move out of the way of their force, that force is going to crush you. So there were several occasions in the fight where Stipe Miocic would be very temporarily backed up against the fence, would then wait for Ngannou to throw a big committed power shot, and then use head movement to dodge that, and then escape out the side and circle back into the center, because that means that there's more axes of movement that are available to you, whereas when you're back against a fence, you can only go left or right. If you've got a guy that's standing in front of you throwing left and right hooks, basically you've got to go left when they are throwing to your right, and vice versa. And, that's a coin flip. Eventually they're going to pick the right side to throw a punch at. So awareness of your position in the cage is massively important. And also, when using head movement, awareness of the position of your head. So Stipe on several occasions would slip to the outside of a punch. That means that his head is essentially too far away from the opposite hand that hasn't been thrown. Whereas if he was to, say, slip on the inside of a right hook, he could take a left, or vice versa. So it's very important to be more sort of conservative with that. You can slip to the inside of shots sometimes, but it's very dependent on the situation, and it's a lot riskier, and it's probably something better utilized against near peer competitors or ones where you're not particularly worried about their punching power. By utilizing head movement and evasiveness in order to open up opportunities for counter strikes by forcing your opponent to overextend, you can then utilize either counter striking or wrestling in order to continue to tax the opponent's system. In terms of wrestling, the reason this is particularly effective is that explosive opponents with a lot of fast twitch muscle fiber tend to be drained extra fast when they're actually maintaining tension in those muscles. You'll find that a lot of really fast twitch MMA athletes, for instance, are often strikers, particularly counter strikers, because it allows them to have a sudden burst of tension and power, and then long periods of relaxation. In the case of Stipe Miocic versus friends Ngannou is obviously a especially explosive athlete and a physical force, and by wrestling him, Stipe was actually able to further drain his muscles of oxygen and therefore decrease the danger that he posed throughout the bout. When wrestling Ngannou, Stipe relied mostly on pretty basic takedowns, mostly double legs and snatch singles. The snatch single is particularly effective against heavier opponents because by lifting one leg up, they're forced to then balance on the remaining leg. Given that they have a lot of weight and are often quite top heavy with big sort of chest and shoulders, it means that by suddenly shifting that weight to another side, they often are unable to maintain their balance and then go over. Double legs can be a little bit riskier on really heavy opponents because if they're able to sort of sink their hips down and sprawl, you can end up stuck underneath them. But Stipe was often able to effectively convert singles to doubles and utilize chain wrestling in order to take down Ngannou, even in some instances where Ngannou was able to defend the initial shot. Even when Ngannou was able to successfully defend the shots, which happened a couple times, particularly in round 5, Stipe would simply convert these to a Greco-Roman clinch, push him against the fence. Either way, he was maintaining Ngannou's muscular tension where he wasn't able to actually take Ngannou down. And when he did take Ngannou down, he maximized use of this by utilizing a variety of rides. Now, to a degree, these were particularly successful because Ngannou at the time was relatively inexperienced when it came to the wrestling. He himself said in later sort of interviews and had talked about that he was so powerful and was just knocking everyone out that he didn't think that he needed to learn any wrestling. So his arrogance was sort of his downfall there, and he obviously evolved into a really fantastic and well-rounded fighter that's still active today. So, anyways, when taking Ngannou down, one of the positions that Stipe was in several times was that he was sort of draped along Ngannou's back with his forearm to the back of the neck. What this allowed him to do is drive his weight into sort of the upper back and neck, which is, relatively weak, particularly compared to, the whole body weight of another heavyweight. Stipe Miocic may be smaller, but there's a lot of weight that's going on to relatively weak muscle groups of Ngannou. And what that means is that he's constantly pushing against that to prevent collapse, which tires him out, utilizes a lot of energy. There were extended periods of time on the ground where Stipe was just battering him with short left hands or with knees to the body in order to just basically keep him there because Herb Dean was looking for any excuse to stand them up. Along a similar principle, on the several occasions when Stipe Miocic had Francis Ngannou on his back, he put his forearm across his throat. Now, there are instances where this has resulted in a submission in the UFC, usually amongst really low-level heavyweights. I recall Alexander Romanov getting them on somebody. Again, I can't remember exactly who. This is the kind of level that we're talking about. But generally speaking, this is not a position where you're actually looking for a submission. By pressing on his throat with the forearm, what he's actually doing is interdicting the ability of Ngannou to take in sufficient oxygen. He's also making him uncomfortable. He's making it painful for him. and he's just making it so that the less oxygen is coming in because of the airways being compressed. Now that we've looked at the wrestling approach that Stipe took at UFC 220, I think it's also worth taking into consideration the striking approaches. So a lot of people, when they talk about a big power puncher facing someone else that's maybe less powerful, although it is worth noting that Stipe himself is actually a very powerful puncher, people talk about sort of sticking and moving, or, if they're trying to be more negative about it, dancing around the opponent. What is actually most effective when dealing with these kind of explosive strikers like Francis Ngannou is constant harassment. So what you'll find is that throughout this fight, there would be relatively low risk attritional weapons being used by Stipe on several instances. So first of all, there were quite a few leg kicks compared to Stipe's usual techniques that he typically likes to use. You don't see him leg kicking a lot. He will do it on occasion. He did it quite a few times in this particular fight, though, because not only does Francis Ngannou sit heavy on his legs, particularly his lead leg, in order to ground himself for big power shots, and that's a way of chipping away at it. It also makes Ngannou feel like Stipe is just close enough that he might be able to catch him if he throws a hook. And I think at one point in the fight, he did catch him off of a leg kick, but there were multiple other occasions where, by leaning his head back while throwing the kick, Stipe was simply too far to really be punished for it, and it chipped away at Ngannou. Also, you had a lot of jabs, and you had interceptions with straight punches. So one of the things is with power punches is that typically the biggest shots are, strikes that are thrown in big arcs, right? So, obviously you can get a big roundhouse kick, but when we're talking about punches, you're talking about your hooks and your uppercuts. So because they operate in arcs, their actual distance that they travel is longer, but that also means that they build up more momentum. So when they make an impact, they do more damage. So power punchers often get stuck into this mode of thinking where they're constantly trying to land a big clean shot rather than just chipping away and breaking people down, which is often a better approach. But they get into this habit of, okay, I just need to hit him. I just need to get this right shot. I'm going to keep throwing these big shots until one of them lands and puts this guy away. And what Stipe would often do is that when it became clear that Ngannou was going to throw a big hook or an uppercut, he would simply step forward and crack him, usually with a right cross and sometimes with a jab. And this was intercepting his shots. It was allowing him to hit Ngannou clean. The impact would then throw the arc off of Ngannou's strikes, so there was no way that they were going to land clean. And in some cases, he would, change it up. There was even a couple of times he just sort of shoved Ngannou in the chest in order to shift him off balance before following up with some other offense. So by being close enough and constantly harassing him, not only is he drawing out the strikes from Ngannou, because Ngannou's going, okay, he's close enough, I'm going to hit him, and then misses and expending that energy, he's also actually exhausting Ngannou neurologically. So if Stipe just danced around in circles and just ran away from him, then Ngannou would basically have the fight at his own initiative. Like it would be frustrating, but he would go, okay, I'm going to take a run at this guy. Now I'm tired. There's nothing coming back. I'll wait to get my energy levels up and then have another go. But what actually is happening, because every time he looked like he was getting a break, Stipe would step forward either with a feint or with an actual strike and hit him, is he's constantly got the senses reacting, like Ngannou's looking and he's seeing stuff coming, so he's doing little defensive movements, or his eyes are watching where the punch is coming from, where the kicks are going, where Stipe is, trying to figure out if he's close enough to hit. The brain is an organ too. It takes energy like any other organ, and it's actually the most energy intensive organ in terms of use. And so by constantly having these little moments of stress, it's actually exacerbating the cardio problem that Ngannou already has. So that harassment, it does do damage, of course, and there were a couple times where Stipe hit him with big shots where you could see Stipe was intending to knock him out. He wasn't trying to get this fight to go for 5 rounds. He was trying to knock him out. And Ngannou showed an incredible chin not to actually be finished in this fight. But, yeah, by keeping his brain active and keeping it working and keeping Ngannou worried, he was able to further exacerbate the success that he was already having just by putting pressure on him, by making him work. And Stipe trusted his cardio and knew that he could outlast him in that kind of fight. By utilizing all these tools together, Stipe Miocic absolutely dominated the relatively green version of Francis Ngannou that competed against him at UFC 220. Ngannou himself has actually shown a lot of appreciation of Stipe and has always been very respectful to him ever since this fight. He acknowledges that Stipe is incredibly tough, and in fact, after he defeated Stipe Miocic in their rematch, he went up to him and said, "Thank you, you made me a better fighter." These kind of skills are things that don't necessarily jump off of the screen. I think part of the reason Stipe Miocic has been underrated so often as a fighter is not only because of, it's always a constantly new fans coming in that maybe are less familiar with his work, but also that when you look back at his highlights, you're not seeing these crazy wheel kicks or these flying submissions or anything like that. There's nothing in Stipe Miocic's career that matches up to, say, Demetrius Johnson's flying armbar or, a question mark kick knockout or anything like that. But what he does do is he generally approaches fights in a relatively intelligent manner and utilizes a relatively basic but well-honed skill set to great effect. And I really think that's something that needs to be studied by anyone that has a serious interest in martial arts, because it's easy to go, what's this technique? What's this cool, flashy way to win? But at the end of the day, there are strategies and there are tactics and there are techniques. And if you have a bunch of flashy techniques and you don't have any tactics or strategy, you end up being a type of fighter like Michel Pereira, who, don't get me wrong, is a formidable opponent, but, he's not at the top of the middleweight rankings, and middleweight's not exactly a particularly deep division. Sure, there might be a lot of people that find him a more entertaining fighter than Stipe Miocic, but, one is the greatest heavyweight of all time and one is a middleweight journeyman. These fundamental techniques and approaches matter, and their intelligent application against a variety of different opponents matters. And martial arts is, at its core, about how do you beat someone that has physical advantages over you. If it didn't work, if learning martial arts didn't help you fight somebody that was bigger and stronger and maybe faster, then people wouldn't bother with them. There's a reason why these athletes learn techniques and don't just go hard in the gym all day, every day, and no technique. Again, Stipe himself physically is no slouch, but Ngannou is, bigger, stronger, arguably a little faster, longer reach, and yet Stipe was able to completely demolish him. Just to quickly read out some statistics, I know it's a boring approach, but for people that haven't watched this fight, just to let them know the degree to which this was one-sided, Miocic is recorded as landing 200 strikes in the match compared to 33 by Ngannou. So over 25 minutes of fighting, Ngannou was only able to land 33 strikes. Of 14 takedowns, Stipe was successful in 6. So, and in round 4 specifically, Ngannou didn't land a single strike and was hit 82 times. Because Stipe was able to take him down, he was exhausted and just completely demolish Ngannou. And frankly, that fight should have been stopped. One little last thing that's sort of worth mentioning is that this wasn't just a fluke where Stipe got in there and found that this approach worked. He had actually done a very similar game plan to Mark Hunt, who was a little bit more technical than this version of Ngannou. And was also a big puncher and pretty fast. Obviously not quite the juggernaut that Ngannou is, but, Stipe grinded him out and mauled him and ended up TKOing him in the 5th round. And to me, the Ngannou performance, the UFC 220 performance against Ngannou in their first bout was really Stipe perfecting this wrestle boxing against a big puncher strategy and approach. So, hopefully you've enjoyed me waffling on about Stipe Miocic and UFC 220. you will have noticed on screen a whole bunch of different slides showing different individual moments where different techniques were used, and to what effect. Hopefully you find those useful. I kept the audio sort of away from that because I didn't want to just be explaining slides for the whole video. I didn't think that would be a very interesting approach. For any new listeners, thank you for listening. If you've stayed this far into the video, really do appreciate it. Please like and subscribe or leave a comment. Any type of engagement really helps the channel to grow. And thank you again. I'm Josh from Dialectic of Violence. Ciao.